In the small, humid town of Lynn, Indiana in 1931, a baby was born who would grow up to hold both a Bible and the fate of nearly 1,000 souls in his hands. His name was James Warren Jones. The world would later know him as Jim Jones, the leader of the People's Temple, one of the most devastating cults in American history. From an early age, Jones didn't fit in. He grew up poor, the son of an alcoholic World War I veteran, and a mother who believed her child was destined for greatness. The Jones family house sat at the edge of town, isolated from everyone else. Neighbors remembered Jim Jones as quiet, but there was something unnerving about him. As a child, he was obsessed with religion and death. While the other kids were playing tag in the streets, Jim was organizing mock funerals for small animals. He'd dress in black, he would deliver long sermons, and then he would preach about heaven and hell to an audience of confused neighborhood children. Even back then, he demanded control over others, and people noticed. As he got older, that fascination with power only grew. In high school, he was known for being intelligent but distant. He'd spend hours studying different religious movements like Christianity, Pentecostal revivals, and even Eastern philosophy. Now, what caught his attention most were the preachers who could make crowds weep, shout, and faint. He wasn't studying faith to find God, he was studying it to find an audience. By his late teens, Jones began attending churches around Indiana, not because, he believed, but because he wanted to understand what made people follow. He watched how pastors used their voices, like how they would build tension, how they promised miracles, and then how they offered themselves as the bridge between suffering and salvation. He took notes. He learned that people would give up almost anything for the hope of belonging, for a sense that someone understood their pain. And that's when he decided to build his own ministry. In 1953, Jones opened the first version of what would later become the People's Temple in Indianapolis. Now, it wasn't much. It was literally just a rented building. It was a few folding chairs and a group of people who were mostly poor, desperate, or just completely lost. But Jones had something that other preachers didn't. He had charisma. He could cry on command, he would speak with the rhythm of a man possessed, and then he would back it up with what seemed like real miracles. He'd tell the crowd that someone in the room had back pain, and sure enough, a woman would rise, trembling, tears in her eyes, saying that the pain was just magically gone. But what they didn't know was that Jim had learned her condition earlier from one of his helpers. Everything was staged, but to the people watching, it was divine. Now, Jones preached a strange mix of Christianity, socialism, and equality. He told people that the world was cruel, that racism and greed were poisoning the soul of America, and that only his church could offer true justice. To the poor and marginalized, it sounded revolutionary, and to the lonely, it felt like home. And to those who questioned him, he was quick to remind them that doubt was the language of the enemy. By the late 1950s, the People's Temple had become one of the most progressive churches in Indiana. Jones opened soup kitchens, he helped families find housing, and he publicly fought against racial segregation. He adopted children of different races, calling them his rainbow family. And on the surface, he looked kind of like a hero, like a man who practiced what he preached. But behind the curtain, his obsession with control was taking root. Jones began recording his sermons, replaying them late at night to critique his delivery, studying himself like a scientist observing an experiment. He wanted perfection. He wanted absolute loyalty. Members were told to, cut off contact with anyone who doubted his teachings, including family. To question Jim Jones was to question God himself, and soon, fear became the foundation of faith. In private meetings, Jones began talking about an approaching apocalypse. He said that nuclear war was coming and that the only safety would be found in his movement. He started to position himself not as a preacher, but as a prophet. The more paranoid his sermons became, the more devoted his followers grew. They believed that Jim Jones wasn't just a man, he was chosen. And super quickly, the small church in Indiana was no longer enough. Jones wanted a kingdom, somewhere far away from government interference, from media scrutiny, and from the corrupt world he said that was trying to destroy them. And so these seeds of relocation began to grow. In 1961, during the height of the Cold War panic, Jones announced that he had a vision. He claimed that Indianapolis, the city where his church was thriving, would soon be destroyed by a nuclear attack. He said he'd seen it in a dream, cities reduced to ash, and the end of the world as they knew it. To his congregation, this wasn't just another sermon, this was a prophecy, and when your prophet tells you destruction is coming, you listen. Jones told his followers that they needed to leave Indiana and find a new home somewhere safe, somewhere untouched by the chaos he swore was coming. After searching through geography books and survival guides, he found what he called the Promised Land. It was a tiny town in Northern California called Ukiah. It was isolated, rural, and most importantly, it was far from any major cities that might be targeted in a nuclear strike. He said this is where God wanted them to go, and his followers believed him. So one by one, they packed up everything they owned. They packed up their homes, their jobs, their friends, and they followed Jim Jones west. The migration looked like something out of a biblical story. I mean, there were buses filled with families, caravans of old cars, all driving toward a dream that existed only in one man's head. Now, when they arrived, Jones welcomed them to their new life. He told them that they were pioneers, building the foundation of a new society, one free of racism, capitalism, and corruption. But what he really was building was a kingdom where he alone ruled. Life in Ukiah started off with hope. Members of the People's Temple worked tirelessly to build farms, to build schools, and to build housing. Now they grew crops, they raised animals, and they shared almost everything they had. And for a while, I mean, it worked. People felt fulfilled, they felt useful, and they all felt connected. They weren't just surviving, they were a part of something bigger. But soon, Jones began tightening his grip. Rules became stricter, privacy disappeared, members were told to report anyone who showed signs of doubt or selfishness. And I mean, families were broken apart as Jones convinced people that loyalty to him mattered more than loyalty to blood. He called it apostolic socialism. It was his own blend of Christian language and Marxist ideology. He preached that capitalism was evil, that the government was corrupt, and that only he could lead them to equality. And he didn't just, talk about it. He made people live it. Members signed over their paychecks, their homes, even their retirement savings to the church. In return, Jones promised them security and salvation, but what he was really collecting was control. By the mid-1960s, the People's Temple had become a magnet for those who felt rejected by society. Black families escaping discrimination, elderly people without support, and young idealists searching for purpose. To many, Jim Jones seemed like a savior. He was outspoken against racism and police brutality, he ran food banks and clinics, and he opened his doors for everyone. Politicians praised him and newspapers called him a humanitarian, but behind closed doors, his sermons took on a whole different tone. He started to speak of betrayal, of spies, and of enemies. He warned that the government was watching them and that they needed to be ready for persecution. He began staging what he called loyalty tests. Now, members would be asked to drink what he told them was poison to prove their faith and obedience. Now, when they survived because the liquid was really just a harmless juice, Jones would praise them for their courage. And each time, that line between devotion and insanity just blurred a little bit more. And that paranoia that once existed only in Jim Jones' mind was spreading like wildfire among his followers. They started to believe that the outside world really was out to get them, and Jones fed that belief every chance he got. He'd rant about the FBI, about the CIA, and how the establishment wanted to destroy their church because it represented true equality. To his followers, that fear became faith, and to Jones, it became power. And soon, even California started to feel too close to the world that he was trying to escape. Reporters were beginning to ask questions about the People's Temple, questions about money, about missing members, about manipulation. And every time someone dared to leave the church, Jones made sure that they were branded as traitors, liars, or even something worse. He knew that the walls were closing in, the press was watching, and the government was starting to get suspicious. And so once again, he told his followers that they needed to move, this time even further away. He said he'd found a new Eden, a place where they could finally live in place, without fear or judgment. A place where the People's Temple could become everything it was meant to be. This place was deep in the South American jungle, in the small nation of Guyana. and he called it Jonestown. In 1974, deep in the tropical heat of South America, a clearing was being carved out in the dense jungle. Towering trees fell one by one, the earth was turned over, and mosquitoes swarmed in thick clouds around sweating workers. It was the beginning of what Jim Jones called a paradise on earth, a socialist utopia where his followers could live free from the greed and hatred of America. But to anyone who looked closely, Jonestown, it wasn't a paradise, it was a prison under construction. Now, the settlement was built in northwestern Guyana, a country thick with rainforest and nearly untouched by modern infrastructure. Now, Jones had negotiated with the Guyanese government to lease nearly 4,000 acres of land. He told them that it was an agricultural project, a self-sustaining community that would bring jobs and development to the region. And on paper, yes, it sounded harmless, but in reality, it was an escape plan. Jones knew that the scrutiny back in the United States was growing too intense to control. Reporters, defectors, and investigators were closing in on the People's Temple. Jonestown was his answer. It was an isolation disguised as independence. Now, the first members to arrive were mostly young and loyal, hand-picked workers who believed that they were building something sacred. They came by boat, carrying supplies through rivers thick with vines and crocodiles. Now, when they arrived, there was nothing but swamp and forest. They had to start from scratch. They slept in tents, they used machetes to cut paths, and they worked under the scorching sun from dawn until night. And despite the brutal labor, they sang songs and told each other that this was the beginning of a better world. By 1977, when the main group of followers arrived, the community had transformed. Wooden dormitories lined the cleared fields, gardens stretched towards the tree lines, and a large open pavilion sat at the center like a cathedral. At its front stood a single wooden podium, painted white. It was where Jim Jones would preach to his people. Loudspeakers were strung through their settlement, wired to a microphone that connected directly to his cabin. So day or night, Jones' voice would, echo across the camp, reminding everyone that he was watching. At first, many of the new arrivals were amazed. Compared to the chaos and racism of America, Jonestown felt like a miracle. Here, everyone was equal. There was, no segregation, there was no landlords, there was no hunger. Families ate together, they worked together, and they sang together. They even called each other brother and sister. Jones himself would walk among them, smiling, shaking hands, and talking about how proud he was of what they had built. It was intoxicating, and for the people who had left everything behind to follow him, this was proof that their faith had been worth it. But the longer they stayed, the more cracks began to show. The food was scarce, the heat was unbearable, the medical supplies were limited, and most of all, Jones' paranoia had followed them into the jungle. Every night, he held long meetings in the pavilion, sometimes stretching until 3 or 4 in the morning. He would rant about enemies, spies, and traitors, and he claimed that the CIA was plotting to destroy them. He said that anyone who tried to leave would be killed by mercenaries waiting in the jungle, and people were honestly too tired and too afraid to argue with him. So armed guards began patrolling the perimeter, and they called them the Red Brigade. Now, their job was to keep outsiders out and insiders in. If someone tried to run, the jungle was nearly impossible to survive. The sounds of insects, the endless rain, the suffocating humidity, it all worked in Jones's favor. There was literally nowhere else to go. And inside Jonestown, Jones' health was failing. His body was bloated, his eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, and his voice grew raspier by the day. And he was also addicted to drugs. Things like amphetamines, or just, honestly anything to dull his pain and feed his ego. But even as his body decayed, his grip on the community only grew stronger. He told his followers that he was the only one who could protect them, the only one who truly loved them. He compared himself to Christ, to Lenin, or to a god who had sacrificed everything for his people. Every Sunday, he'd broadcast his sermons through the loudspeakers, warning that America had fallen to fascism and that they were the last hope for humanity. He told them that defectors were spreading lies, that the media wanted to destroy their home, and then he'd play audio recordings of news reports that were often edited and manipulated to make it seem like the world really was collapsing. And the followers, again, who were isolated and exhausted, they 100% believed it. Then he renamed their daily work to revolutionary labor. He said it wasn't just farming or cooking, it was their contribution to the global struggle against evil. And when people began to whisper about leaving, he'd call them enemies of the revolution. And punishment was swift. Sometimes people were publicly humiliated, other times they were beaten, and on occasion, they were even locked inside a small box for days. It was this little coffin-sized wooden cell that was buried in the ground. But to Jones, all of this was love, okay? He told people that discipline was necessary to keep them safe, that suffering proved their devotion, and he said that outside the walls of Jonestown, the world was full of hatred and corruption, and inside Jonestown, they were free. Now, the contradiction was impossible to see for those, living in it, because by now, the People's Temple wasn't just a church. It was these people's entire world. Every voice they heard, every piece of information they received, every waking moment of their lives was filtered through Jim Jones. And he wasn't done. He said that Jonestown was only the beginning. Soon he would show them what true loyalty looked like. By mid-1978, Jonestown had reached a breaking point. Now, from the outside, it still looked like a thriving socialist community, a place where people of all races and backgrounds worked together in peace. But anyone who lived there knew the truth. The smiles were forced, the songs were rehearsed, and every word spoken within earshot of the loudspeakers could be a death sentence if it reached the wrong person. The tension finally began to spill beyond the jungle when stories started appearing in American newspapers. Former members began to speak out. They described beatings, forced labor, and even psychological control. They said that Jim Jones had confiscated passports and forced people to sign over their property. And more disturbing, they claimed that he was holding his followers hostage. Now, among those speaking out was a group of concerned relatives in California calling themselves get this, the Concerned Relatives. Now, they wrote letters to the government officials and news organizations pleading for help. They said that their family members were being brainwashed and abused, and that Jonestown was not a commune, it was a prison. Their pleas eventually reached the ears of a congressman named Leo Ryan. Now, Leo Ryan was known for being fearless. He had personally gone undercover in the past to investigate prison conditions and educational failures. He was a man who believed in seeing the truth for himself, and when he heard about Jonestown, he decided that if nobody else would look into it, he would. Now, back in the jungle, Jones was furious. He read every single newspaper that mentioned him and tore them apart in rage. The word defector, which we've used a lot, became one of his favorite insults. He told his people that Congressman Ryan was an agent of the CIA sent to destroy everything they had built. He said the United States couldn't stand to see a community where black people and white people lived together as equals. Every story against them was proof, he said, and that they were winning and that their enemies were terrified of their success. But behind that fiery rhetoric, Jones was unraveling. His voice on the loudspeakers grew weaker, his words slurred, and his ideas became more desperate. He accused his own staff of betrayal. He demanded loyalty tests more frequently, and there was even something called the White Night drills, which were terrifying rehearsals of mass suicide. He would make people all line up, and then they would drink the poison, and then they would just wait to die, and he would tell them that it was all a test. But somewhere deep down, many of them started to realize that this wasn't about salvation anymore. It was about control. But fear is, as we know, a very powerful thing. So most of the people living in the community stayed quiet and hoping that somehow, some way, things would get better. As the weeks went on, the jungle began to feel heavier. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. And then in November of 1978, the news came over the shortwave radio that Congressman Leo Ryan was on his way to Guyana. And with him was a group of reporters, government aides, and some of the concerned relatives. They wanted to see Jonestown with their own two eyes. Now, Jones called an emergency meeting in the pavilion. He told his followers that the enemy was coming, that this so-called investigation was just a cover-up for a kidnapping operation. He said these outsiders wanted to drag them back into a racist capitalist world, a world that had abandoned them a long time ago. But beneath all of his shouting, there was something else in his voice, a tremor, a sense that he knew this was the end. He told his people to stay calm, to show their best selves, and to prove to Congressman Ryan that Jonestown was a paradise, not a prison. As the people nodded and clapped, Jones leaned back in his chair, sunglasses hiding his eyes, a pistol resting beside him. He smiled, but there was no joy in that smile. For the first time since they followed him into the jungle, the outside world was coming to Jonestown, and Jim Jones was preparing for war. On the morning of November 17th, 1978, the jungle air was thick with anticipation. The word had spread through Jonestown like wildfire. Congressman Leo Ryan had arrived in Guyana, and he was coming to see them. Now, for the people who had once dreamed of freedom, this visit meant something different. It was hope. I mean, quiet, fragile hope. Maybe someone from the outside world would finally see the truth. But again, to Jim Jones, this wasn't just a visit, it was an invasion. Like I said before, Congressman Ryan's delegation included reporters, camera crews, several concerned relatives of Jonestown members, and a handful of aides. Now, they had traveled to Guyana from San Francisco after weeks of planning and diplomatic back and forth. Now, Ryan had made it clear that he wasn't there to stir trouble. He simply wanted to check on the welfare of the American citizens living in Jonestown. But Jones saw it as an act of betrayal, an attack on his revolution. The day before Ryan's arrival, Jones gathered his people in the pavilion. He stood before them, leaning on the podium, his voice strained but commanding.
"They're coming for us," he said. "These are agents of the same system that enslaved our ancestors, that killed our children in the streets. They will lie, they will twist your words, and they will drag you back into hell. You must not let them destroy what we've built here."
And no, I don't know if that's how he actually sounds, but that's my impression. When Ryan's group reached the small airstrip at Port Katuma, the nearest landing spot to Jonestown, they were greeted by members of the temple. Everything looked calm on the surface. There were smiling faces, there were rehearsed greetings, and there were warm handshakes. The visitors were then driven through miles of dense rainforest before finally emerging into the clearing that was Jonestown. From a distance, it looked almost idyllic. Rows of wooden cabins, gardens, and children playing in the dirt. But once they stepped inside, the illusion started to unravel. Jones emerged from his cabin wearing a loose shirt and his signature dark sunglasses. He looked weak, pale, and bloated. But still, he smiled and shook Congressman Ryan's hand like an old friend.
"Welcome to Jonestown," he said softly. "We're honored to have you here."
Now, that night, the pavilion was filled with people. The temple's choir sang songs about unity and peace. Children recited poems about equality, and Jones sat front and center, basking in the performance, pretending that everything was fine. Cameras rolled, capturing what looked like a happy, thriving community. But the smiles didn't reach their eyes. When Ryan and the reporters tried to interview residents privately, the tone began to shift. A few whispered that everything was wonderful, others hesitated, looking over their shoulders before speaking, and then slowly, cracks began to appear in the performance. One by one, people started slipping the reporters' notes. Small, crumpled pieces of paper passed in secret. And the notes all said, roughly the same thing. Things like, "Please help us," "We want to leave," and, one of the biggest ones, "Don't tell Jim." By the next morning, word of the notes had reached Jim. His smile vanished, and he called an emergency meeting with his inner circle. And per usual, he accused them of betrayal. He said that there were spies everywhere. Some members tried to calm him, saying that the congressman was only doing his job. But Jones wouldn't listen. His paranoia had reached its peak. He ordered guards to monitor every move that the visitors made. Later that day, Ryan met privately with Jones in his cabin. Now, reporters weren't allowed inside, but those who stood outside could hear snippets of the conversation. Jones' trembling voice, his sharp tone, his insistence that his people were free to go whenever they wanted. Now, when Ryan stepped out, he gave a statement to the crowd. He said, "For the most part, it seems like you people are happy here." And then the crowd applauded and they were, pretty relieved. And then Jones smiled again. But Ryan's next sentence cut through the noise. He said, "But there are some of you who wish to leave, and that's your right." A heavy silence followed that, and Jones' face froze. He nodded, slowly, pretending to agree, but everyone could feel the shift in the air. Something irreversible had just happened. That evening, Jones's followers who wanted to leave began packing their few belongings. Some were crying and others were shaking. They knew what leaving meant. It meant betrayal. Jones's guards watched them closely and whispered among themselves. By the next morning, November 18th, the group of defectors, about 16 in total, were ready to depart with Ryan's delegation. Jones shook the congressman's hand one last time, smiling through gritted teeth. He said,
"God bless you. I hope you'll tell the world what you saw here."
But as the trucks carrying the defectors and visitors drove away toward the Port Katuma airstrip, Jones turned to his security chief, Joe Wilson, and said something that chilled everyone around him. He said, "They're not going to make it." Hours later, the jungle would fall silent again, but this time it wouldn't be the quiet of peace. It would be the silence that follows death. By the afternoon of November 18th, 1978, the heat in the Guyanese jungle was suffocating. The sky hung low and gray, the air thick with moisture and tension. At the Port Katuma airstrip, the group of defectors, reporters, and Congressman Leo Ryan stood beside two small planes that were preparing for takeoff. After a tense morning at Jonestown, everyone was eager to leave. Everyone except the men that Jones had just sent after them. Ryan had done what he came to do. He had spoken to Jones, he had toured the settlement, and he talked privately with dozens of residents. Now, what he saw honestly kind of disturbed him. Some people were terrified to speak, others cried when they realized they had a chance to go home, and then when Ryan announced that he'd escort anyone who wanted to leave, a small group gathered their things and followed him to the trucks waiting by the entrance. Jim Jones had watched them leave without a word. But his silence was honestly dangerous. The journey from Jonestown to the airstrip took nearly an hour. The dirt road cut through thick green jungle and ended at a narrow clearing where the small planes waited, their engines humming. The defectors were nervous, but they were relieved. They were finally getting out. Ryan tried to reassure them, saying that once they were on the plane, they'd be safe. And then the reporters were busy taking photos and notes, capturing this almost historic moment. But then from down the road, someone shouted. A tractor with a flatbed trailer was approaching. On it were several men from Jonestown, armed with rifles and shotguns. They were a part of Jones's security force, the Red Brigade. And as soon as the defectors saw them, they knew that something was wrong. And within seconds, gunfire erupted. The sound tore through the humid air, echoing across the jungle. People screamed and dropped to the ground. Bullets ripped through the planes, through the dirt, and even through the bodies. A cameraman from NBC fell instantly, his camera still rolling as it hit the ground. Congressman Ryan was struck several times, collapsing near one of the aircraft's wheels. The defectors tried to run towards the trees, but there was nowhere to hide. The open clearing had become a killing ground. Witnesses later said that the gunmen were calm and almost mechanical. They fired methodically, reloading and continuing without hesitation. Some smiled, and others shouted that they were defending the revolution. Now, when the gunfire stopped, 5 people were dead, including Congressman Leo Ryan, an NBC reporter, a cameraman, a photographer, and one of the defectors. Several others were badly wounded, bleeding into the dirt beside the shattered planes. The attackers climbed back onto their tractor, silent, and drove back towards Jonestown. Now, word of the shooting spread quickly through the jungle. Back in Jonestown, Jim Jones was pacing inside the pavilion, sweating and his sunglasses hiding his bloodshot eyes. He had been waiting for a signal, and now it had come. His guards had returned and told him what happened. Ryan was dead, and the US government would come for them now. Jones's voice trembled as he picked up the microphone that connected to the loudspeaker around the compound. He said,
"All right, my people, it's over. They're coming."
His words echoed through every cabin, every dormitory, every corner of Jonestown. People froze where they stood. Mothers clutched their children. The elderly sat quietly, staring into the distance. They knew what "it's over" meant. They had heard it before during the White Night rehearsals, but this time, it wasn't a drill, it wasn't a rehearsal. Jones summoned everyone to the pavilion. His followers gathered, hundreds of them, filling the open space under the hot jungle sky. He sat on the stage, hunched and trembling, a pistol resting on his knee. Behind him, nurses prepared syringes and cups filled with a strange, bright-colored liquid. The poison he had promised would bring them peace. For years, he had told them that this moment would come, that the outside world would never let them live in peace, that when the time came, they would choose death over slavery. Now, standing before him were hundreds of exhausted, terrified people, ready to believe whatever he said next. Jones spoke softly at first, his voice cracked. He told them that they had lived beautifully, and that they had shown the world what equality looked like, and that now the world would destroy them for it. He said,
"We didn't commit suicide. We committed an act of revolutionary death."
Now his followers cried, and some even shouted amen. Others clung to each other, shaking. Then Jones gestured toward the nurses, who began passing out the cups of poison, his flavored drinks laced with cyanide and sedatives. He told them that it would be painless. He told them that it was the only way to escape the cruelty of the outside world. As the first children were brought forward, the scene turned to horror. Mothers gave the poison to their babies because Jones told them that it was mercy. The sound of crying spread across the pavilion, mixing with the droning of his voice over the speakers. He said, "Hurry, my children, hurry." When some tried to resist, taking the poison, armed guards surrounded them, shouting and pointing rifles. There was no way out. And then suddenly, people began to fall on the ground, convulsing and their breathing slowing. Others laid down beside them, waiting for death. And then Jones's voice grew softer, and he would say, "We're not afraid. We're finally going home." And as the sun began to sink behind the trees, 918 people, including 304 children, lied dead on the ground, their bodies tangled together in the red dirt of the jungle. At the center of it all, slumped in his chair, was Jim Jones. A single gunshot had ended his life. And whether he pulled the trigger himself or had someone do it for him, no one, will ever truly know. Now the jungle was silent again, but this time it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of nearly 1,000 voices, gone forever. When the sun rose over the jungle the next morning, a low mist rolled across the clearing where Jonestown had stood. From above, it looked almost peaceful, a small, quiet settlement surrounded by endless green. But as the Guyanese authorities and American rescue teams made their way through the mud and the heat, what they found was unlike anything they had ever seen before. Hundreds of bodies were sprawled across the open pavilion, lying side by side in rows that stretched into the trees. Mothers were still holding their children, couples were laying hand in hand. Some had died with their eyes open, others as if they had fallen asleep mid-prayer. The bright purple stain of the poisoned drink marked the ground beneath them. The smell of cyanide hung in the air. Now, it took days for rescue workers to count the dead, and the final number was 918 people. 304 of them, again, were children. It was the largest single loss of American civilian life in history until September 11th, 2001. Now, news of Jonestown spread across the world within hours. Television anchors struggled to describe it. They called it mass suicides, then they would change it to mass murder. No one could comprehend how so many people, how many men, how many women, how many children had followed a single man to their deaths. For days, newspapers were filled with photos of the scene, black and white images of bodies covering the ground, faces turned toward the sky. The images burned themselves into the public consciousness, symbols of blind faith and absolute control. In the United States, families of the victims gathered in church halls and gymnasiums, waiting for confirmation of who was gone. For some, there was no body to recover. The jungle had claimed them entirely. Others received coffins months later, sealed and unrecognizable. The grief was heavy, but so was the confusion. How could it come to this? How had ordinary people like teachers and nurses and farmers and children, how were they convinced to die in the name of love and equality? The FBI launched an extensive investigation. Now, they found thousands of hours of recordings, and these were Jones's rambling sermons. They were also his meetings and his paranoid rants. They found letters written by the followers in their final hours, describing their devotion, their fear, and their exhaustion. Many wrote about love for their father, and others begged for forgiveness, hoping that their deaths would mean something. One recording, later called the Death Tape, captured the final moments in Jonestown. In it, Jones's voice is calm, almost gentle. He tells his followers that death is not the end, but a transition. In the background, you can hear crying, prayers, and children screaming. And when the tape ends, there is only silence. In the years that followed, the name Jonestown became a shorthand for the dangers of cults, manipulation, and blind obedience. People used the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid to describe anyone who followed something or someone without true question. But those words never captured the true horror of what happened. The people who died in Jonestown weren't mindless. Many were idealists, people who had wanted to make the world better, to escape racism and poverty and loneliness. They believed in a version of community that was equal. It was Jim Jones who twisted that dream and turned it into a weapon. Survivors who escaped before the final day spent the rest of their lives haunted by what they saw. Some spoke publicly about the manipulation, the fear, and the slow loss of identity that kept them trapped. Others could never bring themselves to talk about it again. They carried the memories like a scar, a reminder of how easily love can be turned into control when one man decides that he is the only voice worth listening to. Jim Jones promised his followers heaven, but what he gave them was death. And the jungle, silent once more, kept their final secret, that even a paradise can become a grave when the wrong person holds the microphone. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been the story of the People's Temple cult and the story of Jim Jones. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe with post notifications on. And without further ado, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Stay safe. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.